I booked a random Airbnb for a quiet weekend away. I didn't care much about where it was, I just wanted something cheap and far from people. The listing showed a small guest house behind someone's property on the edge of a small town. The pictures looked simple. White walls, wooden floor, one bed, a small kitchen. Nothing fancy but clean. The reviews were short and mixed, but I didn't read them too carefully. I just wanted quiet and space to think. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was low and the property sat on the edge of a dirt road. The main house looked old, its paint peeling and the windows tinted with dust. The small guest house was maybe 50 feet behind it. It was smaller than I expected, more like a storage shed that had been turned into a room. The host wasn't outside, but the key was in a small lockbox, just as they said it would be. The inside smelled faintly like bleach and something damp. The air was heavy, like it hadn't been opened up in a while. The floor creaked every time I took a step. There was one small window that looked out toward the main house. The curtains were thin, and from where I stood I could see parts of the yard. Patches of dry grass, an old swing set, and a white van parked close to the fence line. The van looked abandoned. Its tires were flat and the back doors were chained shut. The bathroom was small and had a single light that flickered when I turned it on. The mirror was spotted with tiny cracks around the edges and the shower curtain was yellowed. I tried to brush off how uncomfortable it all felt, blaming it on the fact that I wasn't used to staying in random places. I unpacked a few things, locked the door, and decided to rest. As the evening went on, I noticed how quiet the area was. There were no cars, no dogs barking, not even insects making noise, just a long, heavy silence. Around 8 p.m., I turned on a small lamp beside the bed. Its light barely filled the room. That's when I noticed something odd about the window. From where I was sitting, I could see the faint outline of the main house's back door. The door was wide open. I hadn't seen it open when I arrived. At first, I thought maybe someone had come home, but the house stayed completely dark. No lights turned on, no sound of footsteps. The open door just sat there, like a mouth that had forgotten to close. I tried to ignore it, but it felt like someone was watching the guest house from that dark doorway. I pulled the thin curtain across the window and tried to distract myself with my phone, but there was no signal at all. Even Wi-Fi wasn't connecting. When I lay down that night, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing soft sounds outside, like small rocks being stepped on. It wasn't constant, just every few minutes, a light crunch, then silence again. I told myself it was probably an animal, but it didn't sound like one. The steps were too careful, too slow, like someone was trying not to be heard. Sometime around midnight, I heard a faint knock. It wasn't on the door. It sounded like it came from the wall near the head of the bed. Just one knock, light and hollow. I froze completely. I didn't move or breathe for a few seconds, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. I stared at the wall and tried to convince myself that maybe the old wood was just settling. I eventually forced myself to close my eyes, but every sound made me tense up again. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes, it was early morning. Sunlight was coming through the window. The curtain was still closed, but something about the light didn't look right. It was angled differently than when I had first seen it. I got up and realized the curtain had been slightly moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but enough that someone could have looked inside during the night. I felt cold all over. I checked the lock on the door. It was still in place, but the handle had faint smudges on it like oily fingerprints. I told myself maybe they were mine, but I didn't remember touching it after locking it. I decided to leave for a bit, drive into town, get food, and clear my head. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and still. The main house door was closed again. The white van was still in the same spot, but this time one of the back doors was slightly open. The chain that had been wrapped around it was lying on the ground. I felt a pit in my stomach, a heavy sense that something wasn't right. I got in my car and drove off without even locking the guest house behind me. I stayed out for hours, sitting in a diner, just trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to go back, but all my stuff was there. Around sunset, I finally returned, just wanting to grab my things and leave for good. When I got there, the sun was almost gone, and the property was darker than before. The main house still looked dead, and the van's door was now fully open. I parked close to the guest house, left the engine running, and rushed inside. Everything looked normal at first, but then I noticed my bag wasn't where I had left it. It had been moved closer to the door. My clothes were scattered slightly as if someone had been searching through them. My phone charger was gone, so was a small pocket knife I had brought with me. I turned to check behind the door, and that's when I saw something that froze me completely. On the inside of the door, near the floor, there were deep scratches like someone had tried to pry it open from the outside with something metal. The wood was splintered, fresh. I grabbed my bag and left everything else behind. I didn't even lock the door. I got into the car and sped off down the dirt road. When I finally reached the main road, I kept driving until I saw a motel and stopped there for the night. I didn't sleep. I just sat there thinking about everything that had happened. The next morning, I checked my email and saw a message from Airbnb. It said my stay had been canceled by the host. The note said property under renovation. I tried to look up the listing again, but it was gone completely. No pictures, no address, nothing. Out of curiosity, I looked up the area on Google Maps to see if I could find the house. When I zoomed in, the lot was there, but there was no house, no guest house, not even a road leading to it. It was just an overgrown piece of land. I never figured out what that place really was or who had been outside that night. But sometimes when I scroll through Airbnb listings, I still recognize the same white sheets, the same wooden floor, and that same small window with the thin curtains and some random listing that says, private guest house, quiet and safe. I don't book through Airbnb anymore. I booked an Airbnb for a weekend alone to clear my head after a rough few months. It was a small house on the edge of a quiet town, listed as a secluded countryside retreat. The photos showed a neat white house surrounded by trees, a gravel driveway, and a small pond behind it. I liked that it looked clean and plain. No fancy decor, no signs of people living there long term. Just empty, peaceful space. The host's reviews were fine. Nothing weird, mostly people saying it was quiet and private. That was all I wanted. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, the sky soft orange. The drive there had been longer than I expected. Lots of narrow roads that twisted through wooded areas, barely wide enough for one car. The house looked just like the pictures, clean, simple. But standing there in person, it felt too quiet. No sounds of cars, no people talking, no dogs barking. Just the faint rustling of leaves. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise you're used to hearing all the time. The place smelled faintly of cleaning products, like someone had mopped recently. There was no personal stuff lying around. No photos, no books, no signs that anyone had lived there. Just bare rooms with basic furniture. A small living room with a couch and TV. A kitchen that looked barely used. And a bedroom with one queen bed and a window that faced the trees. The air inside felt a little cold, but I figured that was from it sitting empty. I unpacked a few things, walked around to check the doors and windows, just to feel settled. The back door had a clear glass pane that looked out toward the pond. The water was still, smooth like a mirror, reflecting the trees around it. I noticed a small wooden shed near the edge of the yard, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the water. It looked old, gray from weather, no lock on the door. The listing hadn't mentioned it, but I didn't think much of it then. That first night was uneventful, but I barely slept. I kept hearing faint sounds, the kind you can't tell if they're inside or outside. Light creaks, dull thumps. The house wasn't old enough to have those usual settling noises. I told myself it was just animals outside or my mind being too alert in a new place. Still, I woke up several times, always with the sense that something was off. The next morning I made coffee and sat near the back door watching the pond. The shed caught my attention again. The door was slightly open now. I was sure it had been closed the evening before, because I remembered noticing how tightly it fit against the frame. I went outside to check. The air was cool and damp. When I reached the shed, the ground around it looked disturbed, like someone had been walking back and forth recently. Inside was mostly empty. Just an old rake, a few buckets, and some folded plastic sheets. The floor was dirt with a few boot prints that weren't mine. It felt wrong being in there, like I was in a space that wasn't part of the Airbnb. I backed out and went back to the house. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed a window, I'd glance out, expecting to see someone. The woods behind the pond looked dense, too dense, like anything could be hidden just a few feet in. By afternoon, I tried to relax. I put on a movie, cooked something simple, and tried to treat it like a normal trip. But just after dark, I noticed something new: the lights outside. There weren't any outdoor lights listed for the property, but I could see a faint glow near the shed, like the reflection of a flashlight moving. I froze where I stood, staring through the glass door. The light flickered once, then went out. I waited, thinking maybe it was my imagination, but then I saw it again. Faint and low to the ground this time, like someone crouching and moving slowly. I turned off the inside lights, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. In the dark, the reflection on the glass faded and I could see more clearly. The light wasn't steady. It bobbed up and down slightly, like someone walking with a small flashlight or phone. I couldn't make out a person, just the glow shifting between the trees. I stayed still, watching for several minutes until it disappeared behind the shed. I waited a long time before I turned any lights back on. Eventually, I convinced myself it could have been a neighbor, or maybe someone cutting through the woods. Still, I locked every door, checked each window twice, and tried to sleep on the couch in the living room where I could see the front door. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. This time it was the sound that got me. Slow, steady footsteps on gravel. The driveway. Then silence. I didn't move. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone walking up to the porch. I strained to hear through the pounding in my ears. There was the faintest sound of the doorknob moving, like someone testing it. Just one small click, then stillness. I lay there in total darkness, barely breathing. The knob didn't move again. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of footsteps moving away, gravel crunching softly until it faded. I waited hours before I moved. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, I walked outside, every muscle tense. The gravel on the driveway had fresh prints, boot prints again. Not deep enough to be from a heavy person, but clear enough to tell they were new. The ground near the porch looked disturbed too. Small scuff marks, like someone had stood there for a while. I checked around the back and the shed door was wide open again. Inside, one of the plastic sheets was missing. I packed my stuff in silence. I didn't even make coffee. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked around one last time. In daylight, everything seemed normal again, almost peaceful. The trees moved gently in the wind. The pond was still, but near the edge of the woods, right before the trees got thick, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a small pile of objects half buried in the dirt. Empty bottles, a blanket, and a pair of worn boots. It hit me then. Someone had been staying out there, watching the house. Maybe using the shed, maybe even slipping inside when it was empty between guests. I got in the car and drove off without looking back. The longer I drove, the heavier that thought sank in. The Airbnb had felt too clean, too empty. Like someone had scrubbed it just enough to hide signs that it wasn't always unoccupied. A few days later, I checked the listing again out of curiosity. It was gone, completely removed from the site. No trace of it, no reviews, no host profile. I never reported it. I didn't want to explain what happened or convince anyone it wasn't my imagination, but even now, whenever I stay anywhere new, I check every door, every window, and every shed. I know now that sometimes it's not ghosts or stories that make a place feel wrong. Sometimes it's just someone else quietly living in the same space, waiting until night comes to move. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to where I needed to be for a work trip. It was in a quiet part of a small town, a little outside the main area. The pictures showed a small guest house behind a bigger home, with a private entrance and a gravel driveway that led up to a white fence. It looked clean, basic, and private, exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, it was just after 8 in the evening. The sun had gone down and the sky still had a faint orange line on the horizon. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that made every sound, like the crunch of my shoes on gravel, echo louder than it should. The host had left a message saying the key would be in a lockbox by the back door, and I found it easily. The air smelled faintly of rain and wet grass. The guest house was small but tidy. A single bed, a small kitchen area, and a door that led to the bathroom. The walls were plain white and the furniture looked old but clean. It had a certain stillness, like no one had stayed there for a while. The floor creaked slightly when I walked across it. I dropped my bag, locked the door, and tried to settle in. I made a quick dinner from some instant noodles I brought along, then sat on the small sofa to watch something on my phone. The Wi-Fi was slow, so the video kept buffering. I didn't mind much. I was tired from driving. By 10, I decided to sleep. I turned off the small lamp by the bed and lay there, listening to the ticking sound of the clock on the wall. It took a while to fall asleep. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, not loud enough to be clear, but enough to make me aware. A light crunch on the gravel, a dull thud like something brushing against the wall. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a stray cat, but after midnight the sounds came again. This time closer. I opened my eyes and looked toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but a sliver of light from the motion sensor outside flickered through. I waited for the sound again, but it stopped. Eventually I dozed off again. When I woke up, it was 3:47 a.m. I could see the time on my phone screen. The air felt colder, like someone had left a window open, but when I checked, everything was shut tight. I turned on the bedside lamp. I noticed something strange right away. The bathroom door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before sleeping. It wasn't wide open, just enough to show a thin line of darkness inside. I got up and walked toward it slowly. The floor made that same soft creak under my feet. When I reached the door, I pushed it closed. It clicked shut, and for a moment I just stood there. There was this weird feeling in my stomach, like I was being watched. I told myself I was overthinking. It was late, I was tired, and the place was old. I went back to bed, turned off the light, and faced the wall. It took another hour before I fell asleep again. In the morning, I woke up later than planned. The sun was bright, and the whole mood of the place felt different. I made coffee, checked my emails, and convinced myself that whatever I heard last night was probably nothing. I left for my meeting around noon and didn't come back until after dark. When I got back, the first thing I noticed was that the front gate was open. I clearly remembered closing it behind me the previous night. I pushed it shut and walked to the door. The motion light flickered on, and for a split second I thought I saw someone move behind the bigger house up front. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I brushed it off and went inside. The guest house smelled slightly different that night. There was a faint scent of something metallic like rust or blood, but I couldn't figure out where it came from. I checked the sink, the bathroom, even the fridge, but nothing looked out of place. I decided to just stay up a bit longer with the lights on. Around 11 p.m., I heard that sound again. The crunch of gravel, slow, steady steps. It wasn't windy that night, and there were no animals around. I turned off the TV and just sat there listening. The steps stopped right outside the door. My heart started pounding hard. There was no knock, no movement, just silence. Then after what felt like minutes, the sound of the gravel started again, this time moving around the side of the house toward the bathroom window. I stayed still, barely breathing. I could hear the faint squeak of the window frame like someone was testing it. I didn't move. I just waited, listening to the tiny movements, the faint scuffing of shoes on the wall outside. I thought about calling someone, but my phone was across the room near the bed. I didn't dare move. After a few minutes, everything went quiet again. Completely quiet. I stayed up until dawn, too scared to sleep. When daylight came, I finally stepped outside. The gravel around the side of the house had fresh footprints. Not animal tracks, shoe prints. Clear and deep, leading right up to the bathroom window. The window frame had a small chip, like someone tried to pry it open. I packed my bag fast and decided to leave early. Before heading out, I walked up to the main house to let the host know. But when I got there, the front door was slightly open and the inside looked empty. Dusty shelves, no furniture. It didn't look lived in at all. I walked around to the side window and peeked through. It was completely bare. Just an old empty house. I drove off without looking back. Later, I checked the Airbnb listing again. It had been taken down. No photos, no reviews, nothing. When I tried to message the host, the profile was gone too. I never got any answers about who owned that property or who was walking around outside that night. All I know is that someone had been there and they knew exactly where the guest house was. The sounds weren't my imagination and those footprints weren't old. I still think about it sometimes, how quiet the place was, how still everything felt, and how whoever was out there moved so slowly, like they knew I was listening. I haven't used Airbnb since. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and looked quiet. It was a small single-level house on the edge of a small town in Oregon. The pictures made it look cozy. White walls, wooden floors, a simple bed, and a small backyard with a metal chair and table. I just wanted somewhere to stay for a few nights while driving through the area. I arrived late in the afternoon just before sunset. The neighborhood was silent, not many houses nearby, just a few scattered at a distance. The air smelled like wet grass and old wood. The place looked the same as in the pictures, only older. The paint on the walls was slightly peeled near the windows, and there was a faint smell of something like damp fabric when I entered. The host had left the keys in a small lockbox near the door. Everything seemed normal at first. I dropped my backpack on the couch, checked the bathroom, and opened the fridge, half empty with just a few bottles of water and some old butter. I noticed something odd when I walked into the bedroom. There were 2 doors in the room. One led to the small backyard as described, but the other one was locked. The listing didn't mention any locked areas. I assumed it was a storage room, maybe where the host kept cleaning supplies. Still, the way the door stood there, perfectly painted and shut tight with a silver handle, gave me a strange feeling. That night I couldn't sleep well. The house made tiny sounds all the time. Pops, creaks, the kind that come from wood expanding and cooling. Around midnight I heard a faint thump, like someone walking softly across the floor. It came from the bedroom wall, right near that locked door. I stayed still, waiting for it to stop, but it came again. 3 slow, soft thuds. I turned on the small lamp next to the bed and listened. Nothing. Just the sound of the fridge humming in the kitchen. I told myself it was an old house, maybe pipes or the wind. I eventually fell asleep. In the morning, sunlight came through the small blinds and the quiet made everything feel normal again. I went out for the day, visited a nearby lake, and came back in the evening. When I entered, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The door to the backyard was open, just slightly. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. The air inside was cooler than before, like someone had been walking around with the windows open. I checked the house. Everything looked untouched. My bag was still on the couch. My toothbrush was in the same place. But that locked door, it felt different now. When I stood near it, I thought I heard something faint from behind it, a kind of low scratching. I pressed my ear to the wood but heard nothing clear. That night I decided to stay awake for a while, just scrolling on my phone with the lights dim. Around 2 a.m. I heard the sound again, a dull thump from that door, slow and steady, like something heavy brushing against the other side. Then silence. Then again, a drag like furniture being moved, only slower. My stomach twisted. The sound wasn't random this time. It had rhythm, a kind of pattern. I stood up and walked to the door. My hand shook when I reached for the handle, even though I knew it was locked. I tried turning it. It didn't move. I wanted to check the rest of the house to make sure no one else was there. Every room was empty. The bathroom light flickered slightly and the floor felt colder near the locked door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch facing the hallway that led to the bedroom. Around 4 a.m. I saw the bedroom door move slightly, just a tiny shift like it had been nudged from inside. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my neck. The house was silent again, but I didn't dare go near that door until morning. When the sun came up, I felt stupid for not leaving right away. I checked the listing again online. The host's profile had no reviews newer than a year ago. I noticed something else. I couldn't find the exact address on Google Maps anymore. It showed only an empty lot. I tried messaging the host through the app, but the message failed to send. It said user unavailable. That's when I packed my stuff and decided to leave immediately. But before I left, I wanted to see what was behind that locked door. I don't know why. It felt like I couldn't leave without knowing. I looked around for something to pry it open. In the kitchen drawer, I found a thin knife and used it to try and wedge between the frame and the lock. The wood was old, and after a few minutes of pressure, the latch gave. The door opened just enough for me to push it with my shoulder. The smell hit me first. It was heavy and sour, like old rot mixed with dust. The room was small, maybe the size of a walk-in closet. There was no light, but I could see shapes, a chair, a small table, and something covered with a sheet. The floor had dark stains that looked like water damage, but thicker. I pulled the sheet down and froze. Underneath was a small camera mounted on a tripod facing the wall. On that wall there were dozens of holes, tiny ones lined up evenly, like someone had drilled through to the other side. I realized those holes were behind the bed's headboard. I backed out slowly, shaking. My throat felt dry. I didn't want to touch anything else. When I stepped back into the hallway, I noticed a small red light under the couch. I lifted the cushion. It was another camera, still on. The small red light blinked twice before going dark. I grabbed my bag and ran out without locking the door. I didn't look back at the house, didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. When I told the clerk I'd been staying at a rental nearby, he looked confused. He said there hadn't been any rentals in that area for years, just one abandoned house that sometimes drew squatters or strange people. He didn't know who owned it now. That night, I slept in my car behind the gas station. I kept thinking about those holes in the wall and the cameras. Someone had been watching guests from behind that locked door, maybe recording them, maybe still coming back at night. Weeks later, I checked the Airbnb app again. The listing was gone. No trace of the host's name, no reviews, nothing. I don't know who lived there, or who was behind that door when I heard those noises. But I know someone who used that room not for storage, but for watching. Even now, I sometimes think about the open backyard door, how it didn't just swing open by itself. Someone was inside that house with me that night, standing just behind that thin piece of wood, listening to every sound I made. I booked the Airbnb on a quiet Thursday evening after a long week at work. I needed a few days away from everything, just silence and space to think. The place I found was a small studio apartment on the edge of a little town about 4 hours from where I lived. The pictures showed a simple setup: a single bed, a small kitchen, one window overlooking some trees, and a desk by the wall. The reviews were decent, mostly people saying it was peaceful, clean, and isolated. That was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The air smelled like damp wood and old leaves. The building was small, almost hidden behind a row of tall trees that leaned forward as if they were trying to block the view. The paint on the walls had faded to a dull yellow, and the wooden steps creaked with every movement. It wasn't fancy, but it looked all right. Inside, the room was smaller than it looked in the pictures. The air was slightly stale, like it hadn't been opened in a while. There was a faint smell of something chemical, like cleaning solution mixed with mold. I put my bag down, checked the fridge, and found 2 bottles of water that someone had left. The sheets looked clean enough. Everything seemed fine at first. The only thing that felt a little off was the window. It faced a stretch of forest that looked thick and dark, even in daylight. The trees grew close together, and there was no clear path leading into them. From the window, I could see the shadowed outline of the woods stretching far beyond what the eye could catch. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just stillness. The first night passed without much happening. I made some food, watched a few videos, and went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It was soft, like fabric brushing against wood. I thought it was wind at first, but when I looked at the curtains, they weren't moving. The sound came again, this time clearer. A light dragging noise, like someone's shoe sliding against the floor. I held my breath and listened. It came from the hallway outside the apartment door. The steps were slow, uneven, and then they stopped right in front of my door. I waited, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I heard a short scraping sound, as if someone was lightly dragging a key or nail against the wood of the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After maybe 20 seconds, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before moving again. When I finally got up and looked through the peephole, there was nothing. Just an empty hallway and the flickering light from the small bulb above. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or someone from another unit passing by. But deep down, I knew the sound had stopped right at my door. The next morning, I checked the door carefully. There was a thin, fresh scratch near the bottom, running straight across. It looked new, not like normal wear. My stomach twisted a little, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had come here to relax, not to let my nerves ruin everything. I went out to get some groceries from the town nearby. When I came back in the afternoon, the door to the apartment was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I froze in place, staring at the small gap. The room inside looked dim. I pushed the door slowly and the hinges made a soft creak. Nothing seemed out of place, and my bag was still there. The bed was untouched and my phone was right where I left it. I checked every corner of the room, even under the bed. The only thing I noticed was that the window, which I had left closed, was now open about 2 inches. The curtain moved slightly with the breeze from the forest outside. I locked it and shut the door again. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises again, like soft movements or shuffling somewhere near the walls. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. Slow inhales and exhales, almost perfectly spaced apart. It came from near the closet. My body went cold. I stayed still, staring at the dark outline of the room. The breathing stopped, then started again, this time closer. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel something. That sense of being watched. I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. The light hit the empty closet. Nothing there. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake until sunrise, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the window. By morning, I had decided to leave. I started packing my stuff quickly, checking every corner as I went. When I went to grab my shoes near the door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Small, muddy footprints leading from the door toward the bathroom. They were barefoot, smudged and uneven, like someone had walked in from outside during the night. They stopped near the shower drain. I pulled back the curtain slowly. Nothing there. That was enough for me. I threw everything into my bag and left without even checking out properly. When I stepped outside, the morning air was cold and heavy. The hallway looked the same as before, but the flickering light was now completely out. The silence in that building felt unnatural, like even the air was waiting for something. I drove straight home and tried not to think about it. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back to the Airbnb listing. It was gone. Completely removed. When I searched the address online, I found an old local news story from a year earlier. Something about an Airbnb host who had been arrested for breaking into the rental units while guests were sleeping. He would use a master key, enter quietly, and watch them for hours before leaving. The article said he'd been released after a short sentence and disappeared from the area. The photo in the article showed a thin man with hollow eyes and a faded smile. I stared at it for a long time. The scratches on the door, the breathing, the footprints, the open window, it all made sense now. He hadn't disappeared from the area, he had come back. And for those 2 nights, he had been in that apartment with me. I booked the Airbnb last minute because it was cheap and close to the small town where I had some work. It was in a quiet area on the edge of town, a single-story house that looked recently renovated. The photo showed clean white walls, wooden floors, a big window facing an empty field, and a simple kitchen. It seemed peaceful, maybe too peaceful, but I didn't care much. I just needed a place to stay for a few nights. When I arrived, the neighborhood was almost silent. The house sat at the end of a narrow road surrounded by tall, dry grass that swayed in the wind. There were no fences, just open space on both sides. The nearest house looked abandoned, its roof sagging and windows covered with plywood. I noticed there were no streetlights nearby, which made the area look darker than usual even though the sun hadn't fully set. The host had left the key in a small lockbox beside the door. Inside, the place looked exactly like the pictures. It smelled faintly of cleaning products, maybe bleach. The air felt still, like no one had lived there for weeks. There were no personal touches, no photos, no decorations, just plain walls and furniture that looked new but unused. I dropped my bag in the bedroom and walked through the house. Every footstep echoed slightly. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only sound. When night came, the silence felt heavier. I turned on the small lamp near the bed and scrolled on my phone, but the Wi-Fi signal kept dropping. I turned it off and just listened. The house made small settling noises, clicks from the pipes, faint creaks from the wood. I told myself it was normal. Around midnight, I started hearing faint scraping noises from somewhere near the back door. I froze, listening hard. It stopped after a few seconds, so I told myself it might have been a branch scraping against the siding. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were no trees close enough to touch the house. The grass near the back door was pressed down as if someone had walked there repeatedly. I saw a few muddy footprints that looked too fresh to be mine. They led toward the field and disappeared into the tall grass. I stood there for a long time staring at that spot, then went back inside. Later that day, I noticed something else. The small bathroom window was slightly open. I didn't remember opening it, but I thought maybe the cleaning person had left it like that. Still, it bothered me. I shut it tight and made sure the door locks worked properly. I checked them twice before leaving to buy groceries. When I came back, the house smelled different. Not bad, just different, like stale sweat mixed with damp fabric. I checked every room again, but nothing looked out of place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the footprints in the window. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my stomach turn. It was a faint creak, like someone stepping carefully on the hallway floor. I stayed still, barely breathing, staring at the dark ceiling. The sound came again, slower this time, and then stopped right outside my bedroom door. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I tried to convince myself it was the house shifting again, but the sound of soft breathing came from behind the door. It was slow, steady, and human. I waited until it stopped. Then I got up and walked quietly to the door. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. I checked the front and back doors. They were still locked. Every window was closed. I couldn't explain it. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I noticed something new that made my skin crawl. The small wooden chair that sat near the living room window had been moved. It now faced the bedroom door like someone had been sitting there watching it. The floor around it had faint marks like shoes had scuffed it. My heart was racing. I felt sick realizing I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been in that house. I packed my bag quickly, ready to leave. But when I went to grab my car keys from the counter, they were gone. I searched every inch of the place, under the couch, inside drawers, in my backpack, but they weren't there. I started to panic. I walked outside to see if maybe I had dropped them near the car. That's when I saw it. The driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, on the passenger seat, my keys were sitting neatly on top of a folded piece of paper. I stood there frozen for a long time before opening the door. The note was written in messy handwriting that looked rushed. It only said one thing. "Stop coming back." My hands were shaking. I didn't understand what that meant. It was my first time there. I started the car and drove straight out of that place, barely looking back. The road was narrow, and the fields on both sides looked endless. My chest hurt from how hard my heart was pounding. When I got to the main road, I pulled over and tried to calm down. I checked the Airbnb listing again, thinking maybe I missed something about the property. But the listing was gone, completely removed from the site like it never existed. I searched the address on Google Maps and it showed no house there, just an empty plot of land. I thought about calling the police, but what could I even say? That someone had been watching me? That the place I stayed at disappeared from the internet overnight? I didn't have proof. I still had the note, though. It stayed folded in my pocket for days before I finally threw it away. A week later, I saw a local news post about a man who had been arrested for squatting in empty rental homes around that town. He would break in, change the locks, and live in them secretly, sometimes while people were renting them. The police had found hidden cameras, bedding under floorboards, and food wrappers tucked behind vents. They said he would watch renters at night and sometimes leave warnings for them to leave. I didn't need to read the rest. I knew it was the same house. I remembered the smell, the footprints, the chair facing my door. Someone had been living there the whole time. maybe just a few feet away while I slept. I deleted the Airbnb app that same day and never booked another stay again. Even now, whenever I stay somewhere new, I check the closets, the attic, the vents, everywhere. I can't sleep unless I'm sure I'm alone, but the truth is, I'll never really know if I am. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to where I needed to be for work. It was an old single-story house on the edge of a small town, surrounded by dry fields and a few trees that looked half dead. The listing had only a few photos, all taken in good light, and the reviews were brief but positive. It looked plain, quiet, and empty, which was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the house looked older than it did in the pictures. The paint was chipped and the windows had a faint yellow tint, like they hadn't been cleaned in a while. The air around it smelled dusty, mixed with a faint odor of something metallic. I unlocked the door using the code sent by the host and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. I could hear every small movement I made, from the creak of my shoes to the sound of my breathing. The house had one large living room, a small kitchen connected to it, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There wasn't much furniture. A couch that looked sunken in the middle, a small wooden table, and a single lamp near the window. The air inside felt stale, as if no one had opened the windows in months. I opened one of them to let air in, but it didn't help much. The faint smell of old wood and something damp lingered. I unpacked my things and set my laptop on the table. I had some work to do, but after a few minutes of sitting there, I realized how strange the house sounded. It wasn't completely silent anymore. There was a dull thumping noise that came from somewhere behind the walls, very slow, like something shifting inside the structure. I thought maybe it was the plumbing or the house settling, but the sound came and went without pattern. Sometimes it would stop for an hour, then return suddenly, louder, closer. That night I lay in the bed in the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The mattress was uneven, and the sheets had that old, unused smell. There was a vent near the corner of the room that made a low hum when the air conditioning kicked on. I turned on my phone's flashlight for a moment and scanned around. The walls were clean but had small cracks spreading from the corners like spider webs. On the ceiling I noticed a faint stain, brownish in color, right above where I was lying. At some point in the night I woke up because I thought I heard something. It was a scraping sound, light but steady. I lay still, listening. It wasn't outside. It was inside the house, near the kitchen or maybe the hallway. I waited for a while, staring into the dark, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. The scraping stopped. Then a few seconds later I heard a soft thud, like something had fallen over. I told myself it was probably the old house shifting again. The next morning I checked the kitchen and the hallway. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were still pushed in, the floor looked the same, and the air felt just as heavy. I made coffee and sat by the window. Across the road there was nothing but an empty field with some tall grass and a few broken fence posts. No houses nearby. No neighbors. No traffic. Just wind and dry air. I tried to work again, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. I kept hearing faint movements, especially from the area near the vent and the walls. It was like something hollow knocking against the wood. When I pressed my ear to the wall near the vent, I thought I could hear a faint rustling, like something moving slowly inside. I tried not to think about it and spent most of the day outside. When night came again, the house felt worse. The temperature dropped even though it wasn't that cold outside. The smell of metal returned, stronger than before, almost like rust or blood. I walked through the house, checking all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. The vent in the bedroom now made an occasional rattle, like the metal was being pushed from the inside. I turned off the light and lay still. I could hear faint breathing sounds through the vent, slow, uneven, like air moving past something soft. I tried to convince myself it was just the system working, but the breathing didn't match the hum of the fan. It stopped and started irregularly. Then I heard a small tapping sound, almost like fingertips brushing against the metal. It came from the vent, close to my head. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning I decided I'd leave early, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what was behind that vent. I got a screwdriver from the kitchen and knelt down near it. The screws were rusted and tight, but I managed to loosen one. As soon as I removed it, a strong, foul smell came out. It was a mix of rot and something sour. I stepped back, covering my nose. I thought maybe a rat or something had died inside. I pulled the vent cover off and aimed my phone flashlight inside. The light hit what looked like cloth at first, maybe insulation or old fabric, but then I realized it wasn't fabric. It was something pale. I leaned closer and saw skin, dry and thin like parchment. I froze. I moved the light a little and saw part of a hand, or what used to be one, pressed against the inside wall. The fingers were curled tightly, nails cracked. I dropped the phone and it hit the floor, the light spinning wildly. I grabbed it and backed away, breathing hard. I didn't go any closer. I went straight to my bag, stuffed everything inside, and left the house without looking back. I didn't even lock the door. I drove to the nearest police station and told them what I found. They went to the house later that day. One of the officers called me afterward to confirm it wasn't a mistake. Inside the vent behind the wall, they found the remains of a person. The body had been hidden there for years. No ID, no records. The host who rented the place was questioned, but claimed he bought the property recently. They never found out who the person was or how they got there. I stopped checking for updates after that. For weeks after, I kept thinking about the noises, the breathing, the tapping on the vent. Every small sound in my own house made me tense up. Sometimes when the air conditioner starts, I can still hear that faint rattle in the vents. It's not real, I tell myself. But every time the air turns on and the metal shifts, I can't help but imagine that something is still inside, waiting quietly, just out of sight. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap, clean-looking, and close to the small town I was visiting for work. The photos showed a simple one-bedroom guest house behind someone's main home, surrounded by tall trees and a gravel driveway. The host had good reviews, mostly short comments about it being quiet and private. That's exactly what I wanted: privacy. I had been working non-stop and needed a few days to finish some paperwork in peace. When I arrived, the sun was low, the air cool. The main house sat a little further down the hill, and the small guest house stood at the back of the property, near a line of thick trees that led down to what looked like a dry creek bed. The place looked even smaller in person, almost like a shed that had been turned into a room. There was a single porch light, a cheap metal chair outside, and a door with a key lockbox hanging beside it. Inside, it smelled faintly of cleaning spray and wood. There was a small bed pushed against the wall, a basic kitchenette, and a bathroom tucked in the corner. Everything looked plain but tidy. The windows were covered with thin blinds that rattled softly whenever wind hit the glass. I unpacked a few things, made coffee, and sat at the small table with my laptop. The silence around the property was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle from the trees outside. Later that night, I noticed how dark it got out there. The nearest streetlight must have been far down the road because the entire property was swallowed by blackness once I turned off the inside lights. I could see nothing out the windows. It felt like the kind of darkness that pressed against the glass, like something was just waiting outside. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being in a rural area. I worked for a few more hours before going to bed. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, more like a slow scraping noise from somewhere outside. I lay there, half asleep, trying to figure out if it was just branches against the siding. After a while, it stopped. I told myself not to think too much about it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I saw something odd near the back window. A set of smudges on the glass low to the ground. They looked like fingerprints, but smaller, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window and dragged it down slightly. I stared at them for a while, trying to imagine how they got there. The windows didn't open easily from the outside. I wiped them off and told myself maybe it was dirt from when the place was cleaned last. I spent most of the day working again, occasionally hearing noises outside, Twigs snapping, faint crunching in the gravel. Every time I looked out, there was nothing but trees swaying in the wind. I started to feel uneasy, like the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, but watchful. I kept telling myself it was just nerves from being alone. That night, I made sure to double-check the locks. I even pushed a small chair under the doorknob just in case. When I turned off the lights, the silence hit harder than before. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was near the window again. Around midnight, I heard the soft scrape again. Then another sound, a slow crunching of footsteps in the gravel path that led to the back. I stayed still, my heart pounding. The sound stopped just outside the wall near my bed. I lay frozen, barely breathing. Minutes passed before I finally reached for my phone, but I didn't know who to call. It didn't feel like an emergency, just someone walking by, maybe the property owner checking something. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the faint outline of the blinds. When light finally came through the window, I went outside. The ground near the window had small footprints in the dirt. Bare feet. The size looked wrong, too small for an adult, but not quite like a child's either. The dirt was dry, so they must have been fresh from the early morning dew. I walked around the property, scanning the edge of the woods, but there was no one there. I told myself it could have been an animal that just looked human-shaped in the dirt. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking the windows, trying to convince myself I wasn't being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like eyes followed me from the tree line. The air felt heavier, like the quiet was holding its breath. By the third night, I barely slept. I left a small lamp on and kept my phone charged beside me. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound again. But this time it came from the opposite side of the house, near the bathroom window. The slow drag of something soft over glass. Then the faintest tap. My body went cold. I didn't move. The sound repeated, slow and rhythmic, like someone running their fingers across the pane. Then silence. After what felt like an hour, I got up and looked. The outside was pitch black. My reflection was all I could see. But in that reflection, I noticed a faint mark on the glass again. When I leaned closer, it looked like another handprint. This one larger, pressed hard enough to smear the glass. I packed up at sunrise. I didn't care about the remaining 2 nights I had booked. I didn't even bother leaving a note. I tossed my things in the car and drove straight into town. When I stopped for gas, I checked my phone, thinking maybe I'd missed a message from the host or something. But what I noticed was worse. One of my phone's recent photo files had changed timestamps overnight. I opened it. It was a picture of me sleeping in the Airbnb bed, taken from inside the room. My stomach dropped. The photo wasn't something I'd ever taken. I stared at it for a long time, zooming in, realizing the angle matched the space near the bathroom door. Whoever had taken it had been standing inside. I tried to think how it was possible, if maybe the host had a key, or if someone had broken in without me hearing. I replayed every noise, every scrape, every faint step outside. None of it felt distant anymore. It felt like they had been inside the whole time, waiting for me to fall asleep. I went back to the Airbnb listing later, just to report it, but it had already been taken down. The host profile was gone too. No trace of the property on the site. I contacted support and told them everything, even sent the photo. They said they'd investigate, but I never heard anything again. That night, when I finally got home, I checked every lock in my apartment twice. I closed every curtain. But still, for weeks afterward, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard that same slow scraping sound against glass, like a reminder that someone once stood just a few feet away watching me sleep. I booked a random Airbnb for a short break after a stressful few weeks at work. I didn't care where it was, I just wanted to be away from people and noise. The listing didn't have many reviews, but the photos looked fine. A small guest house attached to a larger property somewhere outside a quiet town. The host's name wasn't listed, only an automated account that sent check-in details. The price was cheap and I didn't think twice. I packed light, just a backpack, a few clothes, and my laptop, expecting to spend most of the time resting. The drive there was longer than I expected. My phone lost signal halfway, and the road turned into a narrow gravel path that cut through thick trees. It looked more like a service road than something that led to a house. When I finally saw the property, it was half hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted gate leaning off one hinge. The main house looked old, maybe from the 70s, and the small guest house next to it was a single-story brick building with a flat roof. There was no car in sight, no sign of anyone living there. I parked near the gate and carried my bag inside. The code worked fine on the door, and when I stepped in, the air was heavy and still, like it hadn't been opened in weeks. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and cleaning spray. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old couch and a small TV. Everything looked normal enough. Basic, a bit neglected but not terrible. There was a laminated note on the counter saying, "Please do not enter the main house. Use the guest house only." I assumed the host lived there but was away. I unpacked and tried to relax. The first few hours were uneventful. I made some coffee, watched an old movie, and tried to get used to the silence. It wasn't peaceful silence, though. It was that kind that made you aware of every small sound. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, and every time I moved, I could hear the echo of my own steps. As night came, I noticed a faint light through the trees. It looked like a small window lit from inside the main house. I figured maybe the host was home after all. It didn't bother me. But around midnight I heard something that did. It was a sharp metallic sound, like the squeak of a gate hinge. I froze, listening. Then came the crunch of gravel, slow and spaced out as if someone was walking across the path outside. I turned off the TV and sat still, waiting to hear it again. The footsteps stopped. Then after a few seconds I heard another noise. Not walking this time, but the sound of a door closing somewhere nearby. I checked the window, but all I saw was darkness. I told myself it was probably the wind or maybe a loose shutter. When I went to bed, I left the small bedside lamp on. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again, not sure why. The lamp was flickering slightly and I could hear a faint thumping noise. It wasn't coming from inside the guest house, but from behind it near the woods. It wasn't constant. It would go quiet for a few seconds, then start again, dull and rhythmic. I lay there listening until it stopped completely. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning I found muddy footprints outside the back door. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and led toward the trees. The mud was still wet, which meant someone had walked there not long before I woke up. I checked around but didn't see anyone. I tried to brush it off and went out to the small town nearby to grab breakfast and use my phone since there was no signal at the Airbnb. When I came back later, something felt off the moment I opened the door. The smell inside was different. Not the same dampness as before, but something more sour, like stale sweat or wet clothes. My bag was still on the table, but one of my shirts was missing from the top of it. I checked every corner of the guest house, even the tiny storage closet, but nothing looked moved besides that. I started to feel uneasy being inside, like someone had been there while I was gone. That night I locked the door and windows, double-checking each one. I kept the lights on longer than usual, pretending to read something on my laptop but barely focusing. Around midnight I heard the same metallic squeak again, the gate, then slow steps on gravel, stopping and starting. I didn't move. The steps came closer, crunching up to the door. The motion light outside flicked on, spilling faint yellow light through the curtain gap. I sat frozen, staring at the door, every part of me tight. I could hear breathing, faint but steady on the other side. The door handle rattled once, then again harder. The lock held. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. The light outside shut off. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I decided to leave. When I opened the door, there were more footprints, fresh ones, right up to the threshold. I followed them a few steps and saw cigarette butts crushed into the dirt. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I loaded my things into the car and was about to leave when I noticed the curtains of the main house were slightly open now. I hadn't seen that before. I couldn't see anyone inside, but something about the angle of the curtain made it seem like someone had been standing there, watching. As I reversed out, I looked one last time at the guest house and saw a figure standing between the two buildings. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything, just stood still, staring in my direction. I didn't stop. I drove off the gravel road so fast the tires kicked up dirt and stones. My hands were shaking the whole drive back to the highway. Later, when I finally got home and checked the Airbnb app, the listing was gone. Not unavailable, completely deleted. I tried searching for the address, but it didn't come up anywhere. No record, no trace. I even looked on Google Maps and the location only showed a stretch of trees. No houses, no guest house. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about the man watching through the curtain. The worst part wasn't that someone had tried to get in. It was the idea that maybe I had been watched the entire time I was there, that whoever it was knew I was alone, and waited until the last night to come close enough to let me know. I still don't book random Airbnbs anymore. I stick to hotels now, no matter the cost. At least in hotels, someone always knows you're there, and someone else has the keys. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to where I needed to be for a work trip. It was a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, about 15 minutes away from the city. The photos online made it look clean and cozy, just a bit old. The host's reviews were short but mostly positive. I didn't think much of it. I was only staying for 3 nights and I didn't need anything fancy, just a place to sleep, shower, and do some work in the evenings. When I arrived, it was almost dark. The street was quiet, with tall trees bending over the narrow road and old wooden fences leaning at odd angles. The house looked smaller in person, squeezed between 2 larger homes. The paint on the walls was faded, the front porch steps uneven. There was a single yellow bulb hanging over the entrance that buzzed faintly. The air smelled damp, like wet dirt and something faintly metallic, probably from the rusted railing. Inside, the place felt still. There was a faint smell of cleaning spray mixed with something older, maybe mildew. The living room was small, with a couch that looked worn down in the middle, a wooden coffee table covered with scratches, and a small TV that was pushed into a corner. Everything looked slightly off, like it had been cleaned just enough to look acceptable but not enough to feel fresh. The floorboards creaked when I walked to the kitchen, which was small and outdated, with yellowish light from a single bulb above the sink. The bedroom was simple. 1 bed, 1 nightstand, a small desk, and a window facing the backyard. The bed sheets looked clean but smelled faintly of detergent and dust. The window glass had small cracks in one corner. There were no curtains, just blinds that were a little bent. I unpacked, plugged in my laptop, and tried to settle in. The Wi-Fi worked fine. I did some work, made some tea, and went to bed around midnight. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to a noise. It sounded like a thud, dull, heavy, from somewhere inside the house. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. Then came another one, softer this time, followed by a faint scraping sound. It wasn't rhythmic, more like something shifting or dragging. I sat up in bed, my heartbeat quickening. The sound stopped after a while. I told myself it was probably the old house settling, maybe the refrigerator cycling on. After a few minutes of silence, I forced myself to lie back down and eventually drifted off again. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The rug in the living room was slightly off-center, as if it had been dragged a few inches toward the hallway. It might have been my imagination, but I was sure it hadn't been like that before. I straightened it and tried to brush it off. I worked from the kitchen table most of the day, occasionally hearing soft creaks from the ceiling or walls. The noises in old houses never bothered me much, but there was something different about this one. The sounds always came from different directions, and sometimes I could swear I felt a faint vibration through the floor when they happened. That night, I noticed the back door lock didn't feel secure. It was one of those old slide locks that didn't quite line up properly, and I had to wiggle it to make it latch. The backyard was barely visible through the window, just darkness and the outline of a fence. There was a shed in the corner, leaning slightly to one side, half hidden by weeds. I made sure the door was locked before going to bed. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time I heard something softer, like someone moving slowly across the living room. It wasn't the kind of noise the house made on its own. It sounded deliberate, like careful footsteps trying not to make sound. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling. My throat felt dry. I thought maybe someone had broken in. I reached for my phone, but it was on the desk across the room. I listened for a few minutes, not daring to move. The sound eventually stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like pressure in my ears. I barely slept after that. When daylight came, I got up immediately. Everything looked normal except the rug again. It had moved slightly, just like before. I checked the back door. It was still locked, but the handle had faint smudge marks like someone had tried to turn it with dirty fingers. I told myself maybe I had touched it the night before without realizing. I needed the stay to finish, so I didn't complain or make a scene. I just tried to get through the day. That evening, I heard a faint dripping sound coming from somewhere near the kitchen. I checked the sink, dry. Then I realized it was coming from under the floor. I crouched down and pressed my ear against the tiles. There was a slow, steady drip, like water falling onto wood. I found a small vent under the counter and shined my phone flashlight into it. I couldn't see anything but darkness and dust. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned a basement, but I noticed a small square outline under the rug near the hallway, a trap door I hadn't seen before. The handle was metal and slightly rusted. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I didn't touch it. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I avoided looking at it for the rest of the night. When I went to bed, I made sure every door was locked, every light off except the one in the hallway. But around 2 a.m., I woke up again. There was a sound this time I couldn't ignore. A soft creak, then another. Like someone lifting the trapdoor, I could hear the faint metallic clank of the handle. I sat up, frozen in the dark, listening as something moved under the floor, slow and uneven. It wasn't an animal. The movements were too controlled. I stayed still until the sound faded. I didn't move until morning light filled the room. When I got up, the rug was slightly shifted again, more than before, and the air felt colder, damp, carrying a smell like wet dirt and metal. I packed my things fast, barely caring how messy it looked. As I bent to tie my shoes near the hallway, I noticed fresh dust scattered around the edges of the rug and a thin line of dark moisture trailing from underneath it, seeping into the floorboards. I didn't bother checking the trap door. I just left. I locked the door behind me, got into my car, and drove off without looking back. When I stopped for gas on the way out of town, I finally checked the Airbnb listing again. The host's profile picture was blank now, and the listing had been removed. The confirmation email still showed the address, but when I searched it online, there was no listing for it anywhere, not even past reviews. Later, out of curiosity, I searched the address itself. A local article came up from 3 years ago about a property on that same street where police had found a hidden basement used by a previous tenant who'd been living under the house without the owners knowing for months. The article said he had escaped before being caught. The house had been sold soon after. I realized it was the same house I'd just stayed in, and that trapdoor under the rug wasn't some forgotten piece of the past. It was being used again.